He could no longer sit on the throne without support. The king's body, once inspiring fear and respect, was swollen, saturated with a foul odor, and juices oozing from the sores on his legs and groin. Brown stains were visible beneath the bandages, which had been applied hastily and roughly, and the cloths, which were changed several times a day, returned from the chambers blackened and caked with pus. In court reports of the last weeks, the words "unacceptable stench" and "threat to the health of those at court" appeared more and more frequently. A chronicler of one of the English monasteries wrote, "Neither doctor nor priest can remain with him for more than a quarter of an hour without danger to mind and body." The last year of Henry's life was a series of continuous illnesses, cruel procedures, and political decisions made in a state that the court physician described as a clouding of the mind from putrid vapors. It began in the spring with a festering wound on his left shin, which he had received many years earlier. Chronicle writers mentioned that over the years it had stopped healing, oozing pus, and then foul-smelling pus. Doctors suggested bloodletting and vinegar and rosemary poultices, rubbing the leg with crushed silver and onion juice, but the swelling only grew. By autumn, the inflammation had spread to his thigh and groin. Along with physical decay came bouts of frenzy. Henry shouted at his servants, accusing them of conspiracy, and demanded the execution of his advisors, who he claimed had replaced his medicines with poison. According to the palace servants, some nights the king did not sleep, but tossed and turned in his bed, muttering prayers and curses. He spoke to the void as if it were a living person, noted one confessor in his notes, who later refused to return to the sick man. The doctors had to resort to extreme measures. He was given opium to ease the pain, but the doses increased, causing bouts of delirium. His body stopped responding to food. Meat caused vomiting, water caused spasms. His face turned yellow, and his eyes became cloudy. According to the court surgeon, his urine grew darker every day, and its smell became like that of rotting fish. Medical procedures became torture, not only for him, but also for those who performed them. Bloodletting was accompanied by a sharp drop in strength. He lost consciousness and came to with a cry, demanding that his blood be returned. Otherwise, his soul would drown in pus. Cauterization with red-hot iron caused burns, which immediately began to fester. The priests who visited him argued among themselves. Some saw his suffering as punishment for the blood he had shed, others as a trial before redemption. Access to the royal chambers was restricted. Only trusted doctors, scribes, and priests were allowed in. Ambassadors from foreign courts reported in their letters that the king is no longer capable of long audiences, and that the smell from his chambers penetrates the council hall. Despite his obvious weakness, a fierce struggle was going on at court between the heirs and influential court factions. Some sought to hasten his death in order to consolidate their influence, while others feared that too drastic measures would cause unrest. Servants, carrying out laundry and basins of pus, whispered in the corridors that the king was melting like carrion in the sun. Once, while changing his bandages, a large piece of skin peeled off his leg, and maggots began to crawl out of the wound. The physician ordered silence about this, fearing panic in the chambers and beyond. Reports from Scottish and French observers of the time contain the same description. The English monarch is alive, but already dead to power. Each new day in his cell was like a siege. Behind the tightly closed doors there were whispers, the crackling of logs in the hearth, moans muffled by pillows, and a smell that neither incense nor wine compresses could overcome. He was carried in a chair with straps and a cushion under his stomach because he was suffocating in bed. 2 servants lifted the armrests, while a third held his swollen leg, wrapped in torn bandages. A thick liquid oozed from under the bandage, leaving brown marks on the stone. The smell of vinegar, old sweat, and damp rot filled the air. One day, the chair tilted to one side, and the king hit his side on the doorframe. There was a short, low sound. Saliva spurted from his mouth, and little more pus mixed with blood oozed from the wound on his shin. The doctor ordered him to stop and brought a bowl of camphor, but the smell of camphor quickly faded. The doctors continued to bleed him, although he was growing weaker. At one point, according to a note made by the court scribe, they let out so much blood that his lips turned blue, and the king, regaining consciousness, quietly asked if they had taken his soul along with the blood. After that, the doctor ordered that opium be given to him before each dressing. The opium helped little. His breathing became more even, but he began to mumble fragments of prayers and orders, confusing names, calling for the treasurer, his long-dead wife, and the chief executioner. A rash appeared on his chest, his groin and lower abdomen swelled, and the skin there darkened and became hot. It was painful to touch him. He pulled his hand away and demanded that a priest be called, then refused to confess and asked for more ointment and wine. There were 2 large tubs of water in the chambers, into which herbs were thrown: laurel, rosemary, sage. The vapors rose to the canopy, but brought no relief. The servants whispered that the herbs only fed the stench. He hardly slept at night, often asking to have his body moved so that his insides would not slide out. Due to his constant lying down, bed sores appeared on his sacrum and shoulder blades. The skin around them turned gray and then split open, revealing wet spots. Linen napkins soaked in vinegar were placed there, but the fabric quickly turned black. One of the young doctors said he saw movement in the wound on his shin. The senior doctor ordered him to be silent and told him to sprinkle crushed charcoal on it. Access to him was restricted even more strictly. 3 people were added to the list of those allowed to enter: the senior physician, the confessor, and the chief secretary. Guards stood at the door without changing for half a day because there were not enough replacements. 2 had fallen ill with fever and vomiting, and the 3rd complained of a strange itching in his palms and armpits. Bowls of charcoal were placed on the stairs, leading to the chambers to mask the smell. The ambassadors were told that the audience was postponed due to illness. The Spanish ambassador sent a letter containing a phrase that was later whispered, "He is alive, but in a different body." A French observer wrote that the king is confined and cut off from the air, while a German observer wrote that nothing but heaviness reminds one of power. Hostility grew in the council. The side supporting the son demanded that the heir be brought forward and his rights be confirmed by a public oath. The side associated with the sister insisted on easing the persecution and returning some of the church lands, hoping to gain the support of the clergy. Those who supported the new order whispered that it was necessary to hasten the drafting of a new last will and testament, while the king's hand was still able to hold a pen. The old nobles suggested not to rush, fearing that any overt move would provoke a bloody feud. The secretary wrote, "Everyone is afraid, but everyone demands a pen." When he was brought to his bed to read the draft of his will, the king burst into a cry, struck the blanket with his fist, and ordered the papers to be taken away before the ink began to stink. The secretary ran out pale, and by evening he had a fever. The priest insisted on confession. One evening, when his breathing became wheezy and his leg burned like a furnace, the confessor sat down at the head of the bed and began to talk about judgment and forgiveness. The king listened, staring at the ceiling. Then he said that he did not remember who had been killed on his orders and who had been killed according to the paper brought at night. The confessor replied that God keeps count of everything, but that one can hope for mercy. The king asked for the crucifix to be taken away, so that it would not look at him. 2 days later, he himself demanded that it be returned. "When it is nearby, it is easier to breathe," the confessor noted. Rumors spread throughout the palace that the king was afraid to die without saying his last words, and was asking for his death to be postponed until dawn. His digestion had almost stopped. Black feces came out rarely and with pain. He was given enemas with warm water and salt, sometimes with a weak poppy seed decoction added. After the procedures, he fell asleep for a short time, then woke up, clutching his stomach and asking to be turned over. A sour taste lingered in his mouth, and he demanded to rinse his mouth with warm wine and honey. His tongue was cracked, and his teeth were bleeding. A servant noticed that black stripes had appeared on the nail plates of his feet. The doctor said that the blood juice does not hold the nail, and advised cutting off the sharp edges so that they would not catch on the sheets. Bandaging became a separate service. 3 men held him down. One removed the bandages, another dabbed away the pus, and the third applied clean cloth. Sometimes the bandage would stick to the scab, and then it had to be moistened with vinegar and left to soak. The king closed his eyes and moved his lips. He seemed to be praying, but no words could be made out. Several times he had strange pauses in his breathing. He would hold his breath, turn blue, then inhale sharply and start coughing, and clots would fly out of his throat. The physician called it a strain from weakness of heart and spirit. After one such attack, the king demanded that everyone be removed except for one servant named John, saying that extra eyes steal air. The servants began to disappear. One was found unconscious in a utility room with burns on his hands. He had accidentally knocked over a brazier and inhaled fumes of vinegar and resin. Another went home and did not return. A third asked to be sent to the stables and never came back upstairs. Word came from the kitchen that the king's food was now being prepared separately in a small oven, and that the cook changed his clothes before entering, and then everything disposable was burned in the courtyard. A new tapestry was hung on the stairs to trap the smell, but the fabric quickly became saturated and was removed. The ambassadors sought an audience. The Spanish insisted on a promise regarding his sister, the French on a promise for his daughter, and the Imperial wanted to see a list of lands that would be returned to the churches. The secretary replied that the sovereign was weak but determined, and that decisions would be made public in due course. In reality, decisions were made in fits of anger. In the morning they dictated one thing, in the evening they cancelled it, and at night they demanded the execution of the 3 closest foxes who are hiding the truth. No names were mentioned, but those who understood knew. 2 were secretly taken from the palace, and another was hidden in the doctor's house. The dispute among the doctors continued. One pushed mercury ointment into the wound and swore that the black stuff will come out. Another believed that it should be dried and left alone, and a third asked for permission to cut it open, to let the pus out and crush the pockets under the skin. The incision was made once, at night. It was done under a lamp, with no witnesses from the nobility, only the doctor, 2 servants, and a priest. When the blade entered, a thick, almost green mass flowed out of the wound. The smell was so strong that the priest grabbed the wall. The king groaned softly, then asked for water. The water made him vomit. The next day, his temperature rose. He raved, saying that the dead had come to him and were sitting at his feet. The priest asked that it not be recorded, but the scribe wrote, "He called them by name. We did not know some of the names." Talk of God's judgment intensified. The confessor insisted on a full confession of sins. The king waved him away, then asked, "How much do I have to say to make it easier?" The confessor replied, "Everything." He began. He spoke of the lands that had been taken away, of blood, of fear. When he spoke of women, his voice broke, and he asked to stop. Then he spoke again, more briefly, more firmly. After that, he fell asleep for a long time, as if he had spent the last of his strength on his speech. The next morning, he asked for the cross to be removed because his head was buzzing and he didn't want to look at it. The guards were reinforced. The inner door was locked with iron hooks and wooden bars. The keys were kept by the senior guard. At night, a basin of coals was placed at the door, and the guard poured vinegar on the coals when the smell became unbearable. Every few days, piles of sheets and blankets were taken out of the rooms. They were not washed, but folded into a pile and burned. People from the lower ranks said that they were burning them so as not to contaminate the water. One of them noticed that the smoke often smelled sweet and stopped eating. One morning, they tried to move him to a small prayer room so that he could confess on his knees as his confessor had requested. To do this, they tied a thick shield to his back, wrapped it with straps, and lifted him up with 4 men. But as soon as he was carried into the corridor, the strap cut into the soft skin under his chest. He groaned, and liquid flowed from under the strap onto the floor. They carried him back. The confessor said that God would accept confession wherever a person lay. The king nodded, but his eyes were empty. Over time, his breathing became intermittent. A few quick breaths, a long pause, then a heavy exhalation with a wet sound. He was hardly urinating, and his body was swelling. Small cracks appeared on his hands, oozing pus. On his feet, around his toenails, the skin blistered and burst. The doctor ordered that it be smeared with fat, and the servant applied it, then wiped it off, because the fat mixed with the pus and began to stink even more. They did not put leeches on him anymore. They slid off and died without sucking. In the silence of the corridors, bargaining took place. Return part of the temple lands in exchange for support through prayers and silence. Promise a daughter, a place in the line of succession in exchange for an alliance with one court. Recognize a sister in exchange for peace for a time. Letters were sent back and forth without directly stating who was asking for what. Some papers were hidden in secret places. Others were burned immediately after being read. The secretary, afraid of making a mistake, began to date the drafts without names, only the day and hour. One of these drafts has been preserved in someone else's hand. If night falls and the light does not return to the chambers, give the seal for safekeeping. The ink is smudged further on. New fabrics were hung in his room, but everything was soaked and sagging. Mold was appearing in the corners. The windows were rarely opened because the king complained of the cold. Sometimes he asked for a fire, then said that the heat stirred up the stench in his blood, and the fire was extinguished. On the table by the bed stood a cup of vinegar water, a bundle of rags, a knife with a narrow blade, a clay cup with thick ointment, and a cross. Sometimes the cross lay on its side, sometimes it stood upright, sometimes it was covered with a napkin. Everyone who entered noticed this and knew how best to speak. Time in the rooms passed not in days, but in procedures: bandaging, changing sheets, enemas, rinsing, ointment, opium, sleep, delirium. Brief moments of clarity, silence. In those brief moments of clarity, he demanded that those he wanted to see be brought to him. Not everyone was brought. Some were hidden. Some were said to have left. He frowned, closed his eyes, as if counting in his mind those he would never see again. Sometimes he asked for paper, took a pen, and wrote 1 or 2 words, then dropped the pen because his hand was numb and his fingers would not hold it. On one scrap of paper was written, "Back to the earth," on another, "Not blood," and on a third, "Last world." These scraps were hidden. The servants who remained began to work in silence. Some stopped eating hot food. Some began to sleep on the floor by the stairs, because they were afraid to go down to their rooms. In the laundry room, they began to boil water all night long. The laundress said that the water turned to iron when the sheets were taken out of it. No one believed her, but she developed sores on her hands. She was sent home and never returned. In the evenings, the confessor read quietly aloud, not always prayers. Sometimes he read psalms, sometimes poems he knew by heart. The king listened, not always understanding. Sometimes he frowned at the word mercy. Sometimes he opened his eyes at the word term. He asked, "When is dawn?" even though the curtains were closed. The servant replied that it would be soon. He closed his eyes. Then he asked again. One evening, He said that he could hear water running across the floor, and ordered that a heavy pillow be placed on his chest so that he would not float up. The pillow was placed there. During the last week of this period, his condition worsened with each passing day. His temperature remained high, his speech disappeared, and only his lips and occasional nods remained. His heart beat unevenly, and his temples throbbed. The doctor, an old man, said that life is retreating from the edge where it rots, and ordered everyone to prepare for a long night. It was not the night when everything would end. It was the night after which there was no hope left. The guards were ordered not to let anyone pass without a mark on the board at the door. By morning, there were 6 marks on the board: the doctor, the confessor, the servant, the secretary, another servant, and a man whose name was not mentioned. Behind the door stood authority, divided into camps and fear. Inside lay a man whose body had become a source of stench and silence. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The end was near, and it would not be quick. Each new breath was like a counter for those who waited. They were not waiting for death. They were waiting for the moment when they could call out the next name. He was still breathing, and each bandage change confirmed that he was alive. But life was already passing him by in the corridors, where people argued about seals, land, oaths, and prayers. And all these words were drowned out by a smell that neither vinegar, herbs, nor the heat of the coals could overcome. The guards became the main instrument of power around the bed. They stood duty without helmets so they could hear his breathing change. The senior guard kept a narrow board with the names of those who were allowed in on his belt. Each name was carved with a knife so that there would be no arguments. On days when the king hardly opened his eyes, only 3 people were allowed in. The rest of the time, the petitioners lined up in the corridor: the priest, the doctor, the secretary, 2 nobles, the ambassador, and a maid with a basin. Tension grew between them. Once, the door to the corridor was pushed open with elbows. The basin fell, and warm water mixed with vinegar and dirt from the bandages flowed onto the stone floor. The senior guard ordered the corridor to be cleaned, and the door wiped because there was a streak on it that did not bode well. In the room itself, the fabric on the walls was damp and sagged toward the floor like wet sails. New records of his pulse and urine were placed on the bedside table. His pulse was erratic, with lapses. His urine was scanty, dark in color, with sediment and a heavy odor. The doctor noted that the skin on the shin had become loose. The edges of the old wound had softened, and a new ring of redness had appeared around it. Pressing lightly with his finger, he saw a bubble of pus emerge from deep within. As if from a crack in the wall, he ordered it to be cut open, but the priest objected that there was already little blood left in the body. They decided to apply a poultice of herbs and vinegar and wait until nightfall. During the night, a fever set in. The king raved and reached for his chest, asking for the pillow to be removed, then asking for it to be made heavier so that it would not rise. A servant replaced the pillow with a thicker one. The king's lips turned black, and a crust formed on his tongue. In rare moments of clarity, he asked for water and ordered his daughter to be summoned. The secretary replied that she was far away, and the journey would take at least 3 days. The king blinked and forgot what he had asked. At that time, the council took its first clear step. The document on the order of succession was brought to the doors of the chambers and placed on a separate table, so that the king could sign it when he was ready. The document lay there for 3 days. Every day it was moved to a clean board. On the 4th day, the secretary plucked up his courage and entered with the document. The king looked at it, asked what it was, and turned away. The secretary whispered that without a signature, hardship would begin for everyone, and slipped him a pen. The king turned his head sharply, and sweat with the smell of vinegar ran down his temple. He said, "Let God decide." The secretary stepped back. The guards led him out and locked the door with an iron bar. The priest continued to insist on confession, He spoke of duty and fear of judgment. The king listened and said once, "Fear is stronger than pain." The priest offered absolution on condition of complete clarity. The king fell silent. An hour later, he called the priest and began to speak, at first slowly, then faster, as if in a hurry, so that his voice would not break. He spoke of schedules, of other people's blood, of letters he had signed without looking. The priest wrote everything down. The king paused at some names and asked for water. A servant brought him a cup. The water made him cough and vomit. The priest waited, then continued. By the end of his speech, the king closed and opened his eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The priest read a prayer of forgiveness over him and placed his hand on his head. The king did not pull away. The servants began to change his clothes twice as often, but they could not keep up. The sheets were stained with blood and pus. The body alternated between hot and cold. The skin in the groin area became raw, and a new spot appeared on the thigh. The physician said that this was bad fluid breaking through the channels. He ordered that it be dried with warm air from a brazier, but the brazier gave off soot, and the rags turned black. A servant named John suggested placing a board under his feet so that the wound would not be touched when he was turned over. The physician agreed. The suggestion was added to the list of tried measures, and the board was used every time he was moved. In the corridors, arguments about access intensified. The sister's side demanded uninterrupted access to the bed for witnesses to confirm that the signature was invalid. The daughter's side, on the contrary, demanded that the doors be closed until the king had regained his strength, and that the signing take place in the presence of a single priest. The senior guard refused both sides and said that access would only be granted at the sign of the doctor and the confessor. This sparked whispers that the guards were deciding the fate of the crown. 2 guards were slipped coins into their boots. They returned the coins and demanded higher pay for their loyalty. The pay was given to them in the evening from a spare box with a seal. Rumors about the box spread instantly. By the end of the week, more pus had flowed from the wound on his shin than before. For the first time in many days, the physician decided to make a wide incision. A table was dragged to the bed. Iron instruments were placed in a bowl, doused with hot water, and wiped with a cloth. The priest stood at the foot of the bed, silently holding a cross. Servants held the leg and thigh. The doctor made an incision. A thick mass began to ooze out. The smell hit the head. Servant John looked away. Another staggered. The king said quietly, "Is the swamp out?" The doctor said that part of it is out. They wiped it with a cloth, squeezed it, and washed it with vinegar. The edges of the wound quivered like living flesh. The doctor applied a tight bandage. The priest crossed the wound with a sign and read a short prayer. The king went limp and fell asleep. After the incision, it became easier to breathe, but not for long. His lungs seemed to fill with a damp heaviness. He began to suffocate with every turn. His lips turned gray, and shadows appeared under his eyes. The physician wrote, "The heart is irregular. Breathing is intermittent. The sound is moist." The doctor asked not to disturb the patient with conversation. The priest objected that without words, the soul would not hold on. They argued in whispers at the door. The senior guard stopped the argument and said that there would be only one visit per night, and the choice had to be made now. They chose the doctor for the night, and the confessor at dawn. During those days, what everyone feared happened in the chambers. During the morning dressing change, when the bandage was removed from the edge of the thigh, the skin at the edge of the wound came away with the fabric, revealing a pocket filled with yellow liquid. A smell emanated from the pocket that could not be masked by herbs or vinegar. The servant John covered his nose with his sleeve and asked for a basin with bandages to be brought immediately. They took the basin out into the courtyard, threw it into a pit, poured oil over it, and set it on fire. The smoke rose straight up like a pillar. The kitchen workers stood in the courtyard and crossed themselves, although no one told them to. By evening, the whole courtyard knew that what had come out had come out. At sunset, the secretary appeared in the chambers with a new document. The document concerned lands that had to be returned to the temples in order to beg for prayers for the soul of the sovereign. The physician refused. The secretary declared that the matter was more important than the pain. The senior guard said that there was another room for more important matters than pain, and moved a stool with a basin to the door. The secretary backed away and left with the paper. That same night, two nobles collided in the corridor, one pushing the other against the wall. Both shouted, the guards separated them, and the next morning, one was given a horse and ordered to leave until the matter was clarified. The other side accused the guards of bias. The king spoke little during those days. At times his lips rustled as if he were counting. One night he raised his hand and, without opening his eyes, ran his fingers through the air as if signing something. The physician noticed this and stopped his hand. In the morning, the king asked where his daughter was. He was told that she was on her way. He said, "Let her not hurry," and closed his eyes. In the evening, there was a quiet tinkling sound. The priest had brought a small bell to summon the servants without shouting. The king asked that the bell be hung on a nail at the head of the bed. The servant hung it. During the night, the bell rang twice, although no one touched it. In the morning, the priest said it was a sign of inner movement. The doctor said it was a draft, and the guard said it was nothing. The servants remained silent. During those same days, news arrived from London about the discontent of the townspeople. It was said that the courtyards were arguing about the future oath, and the beggars had nothing to eat. Some preachers in the markets said that God had taken away the strength of the body to take away the pride of the crown. Several preachers were arrested. One said that he himself felt the smell of death in the church when he prayed for the sovereign. He was released, but ordered to remain silent. It was becoming clear that changes were accelerating behind the door, and the air in the room was growing thin. The doctor gathered everything that could ease the pain: goose fat ointment with herbs, poppy drops, vinegar water, clean cloths, and a tool for pinning the bandages. The priest brought oil and cloth. The senior guard posted 2 new men, young and strong, at the door, so that no one would call for help when it was time to turn the body over for the final preparations. He told them not to look into the eyes of the sick man, lest they falter. They nodded. On the 3rd day of this week of immersion, the king asked that the prayer read to his father be read to him. The priest found the right text. He read smoothly, without pausing, as if afraid that if he stopped, he would not be able to breathe. The king listened without blinking. At the words, "just judgment," a short "do not delay" escaped his lips. The priest paused slightly, then finished reading. At noon, the next dressing change began. When they unwrapped the leg, a pale fabric resembling wet parchment appeared from the depths of the wound, and beneath it was another lake of pus. The doctor realized that he could not cut any deeper without losing the patient right then and there. He ordered the wound to be soaked, placed soft pillows around it so that it would not be pressed even with the slightest movement, and secured the bandage with soft strips. The bandage immediately darkened. The king opened his eyes for a second. They were empty, like those of a man who sees only inner darkness. The doctor said that everything had to be prepared for the night, in case his breathing stops. That evening, the guards let no one in except the doctor and the confessor. The guards argued in whispers at the door. The senior guard wrote on a board with chalk, "Do not enter at night." It was quiet behind the doors. Another basin of coals was brought into the room. The priest sat down at the head of the bed. The doctor checked the bandages and placed a soft pad under the back to prevent suffocation. The servant John sat down lower, at the level of the feet, and placed his hand on the edge of the blanket to feel the moment when he would have to call out. At the end of the corridor, the secretary waited until the argument had died down, then quietly, without shouting, took the papers to the next room. He knew that a signature was probably impossible now, but he was obliged to keep the papers ready in case there was a moment of clarity. On the other side of the corridor, two young nobles exchanged a few words about who would enter first in the morning. The guards pretended not to hear and moved the bench closer to the door. The night fell silently. The only sounds in the room were damp breathing, muffled whisper of prayer, and the crackling of coals. The doctor sat without blinking. The priest held a cross. John, the servant, wiggled his finger to keep from falling asleep. No one moved behind the door. That night was not the last, but it made the next day inevitable. In the morning, they would have to decide who to let in, who to allow to see the face, who to allow to speak, and who to allow access to the body that no longer held the soul. And then they would have to lift the heavy, decaying body, lay it on boards, call those who knew how to prepare the body, and those who knew how to keep silent. And then the difficulties they feared would begin, carrying the body out of the chambers, preparing it, the smell that would permeate the stone, and the dispute over how exactly to lay the body so that it would not float. But that was after dawn. By dawn, his breathing had become irregular with long pauses. The servant John kept his hand on the blanket and felt the body stop rising for a moment. He quietly called the doctor. The doctor approached, leaned over, and listened. The king was still breathing, but the sound was hoarse, with bubbles, like water in a clay jug. By this time, both sides had gathered at the door, the daughter's people and the sister's people. They were held back by guards, but the tension was such